Soft opening in the candlelight. Welcome back to the library. Hello, my dear adventurers. It's Ellie. Welcome back to another evening of shared stories and quiet little theories. Tonight, I want you to imagine something simple. Just a small circle of candlelight. The rest of the library is dark, all those shelves fading into shadow. And it almost feels like we found a tucked away corner somewhere in Westeros. Maybe an abandoned reading room in Old Town, or a forgotten tower in Winterfell, where someone once hid a very questionable book. It's Ellie, still here, still whisper rambling about A Song of Ice and Fire. So, it's time to get cozy. If you'd like, close your eyes or half watch the screen the way you do when you're pretending you're not about to fall asleep. The only sound you need to focus on are the slow, steady voice, and maybe in your mind you can hear the faintest rustle of pages turning, the soft crackle of a candle that's burned low. For tonight, I thought it'd be fun to wander through the deeper, stranger corners of the lore, but we're going to do it in a way that's very unhurried. I'm going to keep the pacing slow and kind of meandering on purpose. Basically, this is the kind of video where you're absolutely not required to stay awake till the end. In fact, if you don't make it past the first prophecy, that's basically a win. A couple of things I want to mention before we get started. Some of you are here mostly for sleep, just using the world of dragons and prophecies as a soft backdrop. Some of you are here for the actual analysis, the what if the doom of Valyria was a magical backlash sort of theory that keeps you up at night. And a lot of you are somewhere in between, drifting in and out while we talk about the prince that was promised and why every translation seems to disagree with every other one. All of that is completely okay. You can let your attention float. You might tune in just long enough to hear that the Night's Watch vows never mention the White Walkers by name, or that maesters wear Valyrian steel links even while they insist magic isn't real. And then you might drift right back out again. Nothing here requires note-taking or full alertness. I'm certainly not smart enough to quiz anyone on this. The thing is, this is meant to feel like being read to in a quiet room, late at night, when the plot almost doesn't matter anymore. We're going to touch on Valyria, on dragon dreams, on those odd little hints that Targaryens like Aegon the Conqueror maybe saw visions of the long night, but always in this soft, candlelit way. Does that sound good? Okay, enough rambling for the moment. Settle in. Find a comfortable position and let the candles burn low, because in a second we're going to open our first dusty volume and start with a prophecy that might not mean what anyone thinks it means. Tonight's journey, quiet theories in the shadows of Westeros. Welcome back to another evening of shared stories and adventures, my dear adventurers. Close your eyes if you'd like, and imagine that first dusty volume opening in your hands, the candlelight catching on old ink and stranger names. For tonight, I thought it'd be fun to do something very simple on the surface and completely unmanageable underneath. We're just going to wander through a bunch of lore theories for A Song of Ice and Fire. Basically, we're taking a slow nighttime walk through the parts of the story that George hints at and then kind of wanders away from before giving us a clear answer. More specifically, we're going to stay in the books, in that deep world-building space where the margins are crowded with little mysteries. The thing is, the show gives us one version of events, but on the page there are so many shadows he never fully lights up. So we'll be drifting between those shadows, the secret history of Valyria, the tangle of prophecies, the cold riddles of the north, the soft murmur of dragon dreams, and the quiet conspiracies that might be unfolding in Old Town and King's Landing, while everyone else is busy stabbing each other For some context, Valyria is a perfect place to start dozing off to impossible questions. The doom happened in a single day, wiped out an empire, and left almost no first-hand records, which is basically an open invitation for fan theories. Was it a magical backlash from overusing dragons, a deliberate attack by rival sorcerers, some cosmic bill finally coming due? We're not going to solve that tonight, but we are going to let our thoughts circle it slowly, like dragons over smoking ruins. From there, we'll slip into prophecy, where everything sounds important and nothing is clear. Azor Ahai, the prince that was promised. All these visions that probably went through a few messy translations and maybe a maester with an agenda. Why do different texts phrase the same promise differently? Is it one person, several people, or a symbol the characters keep trying to force into a single hero shape? We'll hold those questions very lightly, like you might hold a dream right before it fades. We'll also head north, past the wall, into the old stories about the others, the Night's King, and what the wall is actually for. The Night's Watch vows never even mention White Walkers, just terrors of the dark, which is such a wonderfully vague phrase. Then, of course, there are Targaryen bloodlines and dragon lore, those strange dragon dreams that Daenerys and maybe even Aegon the Conqueror had about the long night. Are those dreams warnings, memories, or just narrative tinfoil we're not smart enough to fold properly? And finally, under all of that, we'll keep an ear out for the soft-footed conspiracies, Varys and Littlefinger moving pieces in the dark, maesters with Valyrian steel links who study magic while pretending it doesn't exist, faceless men who might be tied to the doom itself. Is that way too much for one night? Absolutely, but that's kind of the point. We're just going to drift along the surface, let the patterns blur at the edges, and maybe fall asleep long before we get anywhere close to an answer. Okay, enough rambling. It's time to get cozy, turn the page, and start with that first uneasy prophecy waiting in the dark. How to drift through this video, timestamps, spoilers, and safety nets. So before we dive into that first uneasy prophecy, a couple of things I want to mention before we get started. Think of this as your little map of Westeros tucked into the front of the book, my dear adventurers. Down in the description, you'll find detailed timestamps for each theory and topic. Basically, every time we wander from, say, the doom of Valyria, to the prince that was promised, to the Night's King and the wall, there's a marker you can jump to. If you only care about Targaryen dragon dreams tonight, you can skip straight there. If you fall asleep halfway through my rambling about maesters and their Valyrian steel links, you can always come back tomorrow and find the exact spot where you drifted off. Think of those timestamps as your safety net. You don't have to stay fully awake. You don't have to remember everything. And you definitely don't have to feel guilty if your brain checks out for a while. You can just let the lore wash over you, knowing that if you wake up at 3 a.m. wondering, wait, what was that theory about Aegon's prophetic dream? The path back is already laid out. For some context, this video is going to be very book-focused. We're drawing from the text of A Song of Ice and Fire, from interviews, and from the sort of book-based speculation that fans in the dark libraries of Old Town love to whisper about. What we are not going to do is suddenly spring the show's very controversial ending on you without warning. If I mention TV-only material at all, I'll either keep it clearly separated or wave a big, gentle flag first. That spoiler scope matters, especially if you're mid-series. Maybe you're still in A Storm of Swords, or just meeting the faceless men in Bravos. and you do not want to hear detailed theories about the other's true purpose at the end of the saga. Whenever we get to a major late book spoiler, like something tied to the pink letter or the deeper implications of the House of the Undying, I'll pause, tell you exactly what books we're drawing from, and give you a moment to skip ahead without jolting yourself awake in a panic. And the thing is, there isn't one correct way to listen. Some of you are going to treat this like a podcast, cooking or commuting, while we talk about whether the doom of Valyria was a magical backlash or a deliberate attack by rival sorcerers. Some of you are here to use my voice as soft background noise, letting the names blur while you drift off. Both are completely valid. I'm probably not smart enough to keep all these theories straight in my own head either, so we're in this together. At some point, I'm even going to say, okay, if you're still awake, we're about to get weird, just to check who's still with me. That's your pattern interrupt. If you're awake, it's a cue that we're about to tackle something wild, like the wall's secret purpose. If you're already asleep, well, future you can find it with the timestamps. So, with our safety nets in place and our spoiler boundaries drawn, welcome back, my dear adventurers. It's time to get cozy and step into our first real mystery, the tangled prophecies of Azor Ahai and the prince that was promised, and what they might actually be trying to tell us. Not my theories, just my candlelight. Disclaimers and attributions. Before we dive headfirst into prophecy knots and dragon dreams, there are a couple of things I want to mention before we get started. Think of this as lighting a little candle in the corner of the library so we can see where all these ideas are actually coming from. So, first important thing, these theories are very much not just mine. Basically, what we're wandering through tonight is the result of years and years of fan discussions, essays, comment threads, and big-brained analysis from people who, frankly, are definitely smarter and more detail-oriented than I am. I'm just the person sitting here in the dark, whispering their best ideas back to you in a sleep-friendly way. For some context, the idea that Lightbringer might be a person instead of a sword didn't just pop into my head one evening with a cup of tea. It comes from fans digging into Martin's interviews about Zoroastrianism and Catholic beliefs, from people noticing how often holy objects in his inspirations are actually bloodlines. The same goes for theories about the doom of Valyria being a magical backlash rather than a random volcano day. That's the fandom connecting tiny lore crumbs and going, wait, what if? My role here is kind of like a storyteller and organizer. I'm not discovering new continents. I'm drawing you a calmer, cozier map of the ones the community has already charted. I try to weave together all these scattered ideas, add some book context, bring in details like the Maester's Valyrian steel links, or Aegon's dragon dreams, and then present everything in a way that you can actually fall asleep to. No frantic lore dumping, just a slow walk through the archives. Because of that, I want to give credit where it's due. The essays, channels, and posts that inspired particular theories will be linked down in the description for anyone who wants to dive deeper when you're more awake. If you ever think, wait, that bit about the Night's Watch vows not naming the others directly was interesting, where did that come from? You'll be able to track it back and see the original deep dives. And just to keep the pressure low, these are theories, they're possibilities, not promises. The thing is, George loves to play with unreliable history and conflicting visions, so there probably isn't one single correct answer to who the prince that was promised is, or what really caused the doom. You absolutely do not have to pick a side and defend it like you're on trial in the Red Keep. So if you find yourself drifting off while we're talking about the true purpose of the wall or secret Targaryen rituals, that's perfect. Let the details wash over you. You can always come back later, follow the links, and argue with the smart people. For tonight, I thought it'd be fun if we simply let the fandom's best ideas carry us onward, straight into our first angle of prophecy, what the Azor Ahai and prince that was promised visions might really be hiding. Canon, headcanon, and the show that shall not be named. So, before we dive headfirst into Azor Ahai and all those tangled visions, there are a couple of things I want to mention before we get started on the actual theories. Think of this as us quietly agreeing on the rules of the game for tonight. For some context, everything we're doing here rests on the books. A Psalm of Ice and Fire, the World Book, the Dunk and Egg stories, the official histories and interviews. That's our bedrock. When I say canon in this secret little reading room of ours, I mean the words George actually wrote, not what a director thought would look cool in a battle scene. Now, I know what you're wondering. What about the show? The thing is, the early seasons track the books closely enough that we can sometimes use them as a kind of sketch or hint, especially when they line up with book foreshadowing. But once we drift into the later seasons, especially the ending, we are entering the land of optional reality. You are very welcome, my dear adventurers, to gently pretend certain things never happened. I certainly do, purely for scientific reasons. So here's our simple rule of thumb. If the book and the show conflict, we go with the books. Every time. If something exists only in the show, I'll flag it clearly before I use it. Like, okay, this next part is show only, so handle with tongs. That way, if you want a pure book lore experience, you can mentally set those details aside and stay in the cozy, slightly dusty library of the text. Speculation-wise, we're going to start from solid ground. We'll look at passages, patterns, and those little offhand comments Martin makes in interviews, like when he talks about Aegon the Conqueror maybe having dragon dreams of the long night. Then, slowly, we'll let ourselves drift into softer, dreamier territory. What if the doom of Valyria was a magical backlash instead of an accident? What if the Night's Watch vows hide a broader, older enemy than just the others? Basically, we'll move from "this is strongly suggested by the text" to "this is a fun, maybe true campfire story." I'll try to tell you where we are on that spectrum, because I am definitely not smart enough to pretend my wildest ideas are proven fact. Think of this space as a quiet, candlelit annex off the main library of Old Town. It's time to get cozy, to whisper about the theories the maesters would roll their eyes at, and to rebuild the story in a way that feels a bit more mysterious, a bit more satisfying. And with our rules in place, we can finally turn back to that first knot of prophecy and ask, what are the visions of Azor Ahai and the prince that was promised really trying to warn us about? Getting cozy with the unknown, from rambling to realms of lore. So, if that was our little tour through the rules and the prophecies, this is where we very gently step through the doorway into the story itself. We've been standing in the foyer of the main library of Old Town, talking about labels and shelves and how not to get lost. But now, I want us to actually wander into the stacks together. Okay, I'll stop rambling about rules and links now. Okay, enough rambling. It's time to get cozy in a more literal way. If you haven't already, my dear adventurers, this is your invitation to shift around a bit. Find a softer spot on the pillow. Maybe pull the blanket up over your shoulder. If your screen is a bit bright, you can dim it down or just turn your phone face down and let the sound do the work. If you've got a glass of water nearby, take a slow sip. Let your shoulders drop You don't need to watch the visuals or keep track of every single name. You can kind of drift in and out. The lore will still be here, quietly piling up like snow outside the wall. And if your eyes want to close already, that's actually perfect. You're allowed to fall asleep before we even finish the first theory. For tonight, I thought it'd be fun to imagine that, instead of tinfoil hats, we're putting on these very dignified little tinfoil crowns. Nothing sharp, nothing crackly, just a silly, shiny reminder that we're in full theory mode now. The thing is, even the wildest ideas in this world usually have some strange little thread of text or history behind them, and that's what we're going to follow. For some context, almost every mystery in A Song of Ice and Fire can be traced back, in one way or another, to a single disaster, the doom of Valyria. It happened in a single day, wiping out an empire and leaving almost no first-hand records, which is basically George handing us an enormous blank page and saying, "Go on then, speculate." So, let's begin with the oldest mystery of all, the fall of Valyria. We're going to move slowly here. What if the doom isn't just a background tragedy, but the quiet engine behind dragons, prophecies, and even those secretive groups like the Maesters and the Faceless Men? Why do the Maesters wear Valyrian steel links while insisting magic is nonsense? Why do so many Targaryens, from Aegon the Conqueror to Daenerys, dream about fire and the long night, as if some buried warning is still echoing from that lost continent? In the next part, we'll start with one simple, unsettling question about Valyria that might tie all of that together, and maybe, just maybe, change how you think about who really caused the doom in the first place. The day fire went silent, the doom of Valyria and its echoes. So let's follow that unsettling question straight into the heart of the story. My dear adventurers, what kind of power could erase an empire in a single day and still whisper in the dreams of its distant heirs? For some context, we need to drift back to Valyria at its height. Picture a long, smoking peninsula ringed with volcanoes, where the sky is streaked with ash and dragonfire instead of clouds. The Valyrian freehold wasn't just a kingdom, it was basically a magical superpower, an empire of dragonlords who rode living weapons and carved roads, cities, even mountains, with fire and sorcery. Their slaves mined the 14 flames, their smiths forged Valyrian steel, and their magisters played with blood and shadow the way other people play with trade agreements. And then, in one day, it ended. The volcanoes erupted together, the earth split, the seas boiled, and the greatest city in the world simply vanished. No evacuation, no long decline, just ash and screams and silence. Almost no first-hand records survived, which is very convenient for us tinfoil hat enjoyers, and very inconvenient for historians, when all you have are cracked reports from distant colonies and half-remembered prophecies. The lore turns into a kind of Rorschach test. What you think caused the doom says a lot about how you read the rest of the story. Okay, so the first big theory is magical backlash. Basically, that Valyria treated dragons and blood sorcery like an endlessly rechargeable battery, and the world finally short-circuited. Maybe every binding spell, every piece of Valyrian steel, every dragon breeding ritual left a kind of metaphysical debt that came due all at once. If that's true, the doom becomes a cosmic warning label. Use too much fire, and the world burns you back. The second idea is more grounded, a natural volcanic chain reaction. The 14 flames are a connected system, after all. Imagine centuries of mining, tunnels, and maybe a few careless fire rituals weakening the crust. until one eruption triggers the next, and so on. In that reading, Valyria isn't punished by the gods. It's punished by geology, which, honestly, feels very Martin. Then we have the spicier option, deliberate sabotage. Some fans point to the faceless men born in the hellish mines of Valyria as possible culprits. If your origin story is, we learned mercy by ending suffering in the volcano tunnels, is it really that wild to imagine a final, merciful assassination of an entire empire? Or maybe rival sorcerers, hidden cults, even maesters meddling from afar? There's room for a lot of quiet conspiracies here. The thing is, whichever theory you prefer changes how you see the Targaryens in Westeros. If the doom was magical backlash, then Aegon on Dragonstone is basically a survivor of a magical addiction crash, inheriting both power and trauma. Valyrian steel scarcity, their isolation on that bleak little island, the way Targaryens hoard dragons and cling to prophecy. All of that feels like a family trying not to repeat a half-understood catastrophe. If it was just volcanoes, their dreams of fire and long nights start to look like overcorrections, people seeing destiny where there's really only random disaster. And if it was a deliberate attack, then every Valyrian blade in Westeros, every dragon egg, becomes a leftover piece in someone else's long game. In the next part, we'll lean into that last possibility and ask, if the doom was done on purpose, who in the present might still be finishing that work, and what that means for the return of dragons now. It's time to get cozy with a few very patient, very quiet assassins. Whispers in the fire, did the faceless men kill an empire? So, my dear adventurers, if we're going to get cozy with quiet assassins, we have to talk about the loudest thing they might have ever done, ending an empire in a single day. The core idea here is simple and also kind of wild. What if the faceless men didn't just escape Valyria's slave mines? What if they burned the whole system down behind them? Basically, the theory is that the first faceless man, born in the hellish mines under the 14 flames, helped orchestrate or trigger the doom itself as the ultimate act of liberation. For some context, a world book tells us that the Order's origin lies in those mines, where slaves from 100 peoples toiled in the shadow of Valyrian sorcery. The first gift of death is given to a suffering slave, then to a cruel master. From there, we jump centuries ahead, and suddenly these former mine rats have a temple of black and white marble in Bravos, vaults full of coin, and a reputation that makes kings nervous. How do you get from half naked in the 14 flames to quietly rich and globally feared? One answer is, you were there when the volcanoes went off. The thing is, the doom is described almost like a magical chain reaction. Mountains explode, the land shatters, dragons scream and fall from the sky, and it all happens in one day with no clear, mundane cause. Some readers see that as overused dragons or a magical accident, but if you squint, it also looks a lot like sabotage. Not one volcano, but 14, all tied to the same network of blood magic that kept Valyria on top. So, what would sabotage even look like? Maybe the faceless men targeted key dragonlords who maintained those rituals, quietly removing the linchpins that kept the 14 flames stable. Maybe they interfered with the sacrifices and spells that channeled the fire, twisting a protection rite into a detonation. Or, if we want to go full tinfoil hat for tonight, I thought it'd be fun to imagine them crafting some inverse of Valyrian sorcery, a kind of anti-ritual that turned all that power inward. If that's even half right, it reframes the faceless men completely. They're not just assassins for hire, they're long game players who topple empires when the scales of suffering get too heavy. They might see themselves as cosmic bookkeepers, balancing ledgers written in blood and fire. It also makes their later hatred of slavery feel less like a quirk and more like a founding trauma. And if they once ended dragons, why might they care about dragons returning now? A girl in Marine hatching 3 eggs, a comet in the sky, old prophecies about a promised prince waking dragons from stone. All of that would ping very loudly on the radar of people who already watched one dragon empire go too far. Are they trying to prevent a second doom, or quietly guide this new fire towards some purpose we don't quite understand yet? Okay, enough rambling. In the next part, we'll follow that question into the present and ask, when a faceless man looks at Daenerys, Jon, or even certain Valyrian-looking bastards in Westeros, what do they actually see, and who might be marked for a very quiet, very final gift next? A quick lantern in the dark, regrounding in Valyria 101. So before we race off to assassins and dragon queens again, it's time to get cozy and light a little lantern in the dark together. Think of this as a tiny rest stop on the King's Road of tinfoil, where we stretch our legs, take a breath, and remember where in the world we actually are. For some context, let's zoom way out. The Valyrians were, basically, the Fire People, an old empire in the Far East long before the main story, who rode dragons like we ride horses and built everything with fire and blood magic. They carved roads of fused black stone, raised cities with dragon flame, and treated sorcery the way we treat engineering. Impressive, terrifying, not super big on workplace safety. They were also a slave empire. That's important. Their power ran on chained captives in the mines and on the battlefields, surrounded by rituals and spells most people in Westeros only half remember as spooky bedtime stories. Then, in a single day, the doom of Valyria hit. Volcanoes, earthquakes, dragons screaming, and almost every Valyrian died. The empire vanished, leaving behind smoking ruins and a lot of unanswered questions. Now, on the other side of the map, we have the Faceless Men. Just to reground us, they're a secretive guild of assassins from Bravos, who worship the many-faced god, the god of death. People pay them to kill, but in their minds they're not murderers for hire. They're giving the gift of death to those who are ready for it, or who should be. So the theory we just played with can be boiled down to one simple question. Did the people who hate slavery so much that they worship death actually destroy the slave empire that created them? In plainer terms, did the Faceless Men somehow cause the doom of Valyria as a kind of cosmic prison break? If your brain checked out somewhere around volcanic blood sorcery feedback loop, that's completely okay, my dear adventurers. This is sleep lore. You're allowed to drift. The thing is, the important part isn't memorizing every step of the theory. It's feeling how all these pieces of the world might secretly connect. Slaves in dark mines, whispers of a god of death, an empire that flies too close to the sun and falls in one terrible day. Let's slow down even more for a moment. Imagine the ruins of Valyria at night. No dragons, no screaming, just the soft hiss of distant steam vents and the sea washing in and out of broken harbours, fused black stone roads leading nowhere, a Valyrian steel sword half buried in ash. Above it all, a red glow on the horizon where the earth never really cooled. And somewhere in that silence, maybe, the echo of a prayer from a Bravosi temple far away. Here's a little pattern interrupt for your sleepy brain. What if none of the prophecies we argue about are actually about the living at all, but about who gets to choose how the world dies? We'll get there soon. For tonight, I thought it'd be fun to treat this quiet moment in Valyria as our bridge. From here, we're going to walk slowly toward prophecy. Azor Ahai, the prince that was promised, all those tangled visions, and ask how a dead empire's ghosts might still be writing the future. Songs in the Smoke, Azor Ahai and the prince that was promised. So, since we've just walked out of the smoking ruins of Valyria together, my dear adventurers, it's time to get cozy with the stories people tell to make sense of all that fire. When the world falls apart, humans reach for bedtime stories, and in Westeros, those stories have names like Azor Ahai and the prince that was promised. For some context, imagine this like an old tale whispered by the hearth. Once upon a time, in the darkness before history, there was a hero called Azor Ahai. He tried 3 times to forge a magic sword, Lightbringer, to drive back an endless night. On the 3rd try, he plunged the blade into the heart of his beloved Nissa, and her life, her soul, somehow flowed into the steel, making it burn with light. It's brutal, it's tragic, and it sounds suspiciously like the kind of myth you tell a scared child about why the sun still rises. Then, much later, we get a sort of sequel. The prince that was promised, a child of smoke and salt, born under a bleeding star, destined to wake dragons from stone and stand against the darkness. Okay, so that sounds straightforward, right? Basically, chosen one stuff. But the thing is, the wording shifts every time we see it. In Valyrian, the word for prince is gender neutral. In some Targaryen records, it's a prince. In others, a hero. In others, just the one. Melisandre mashes it into Azor Ahai reborn. Maesters roll their eyes and mutter about translation errors. Martin has said he loves how real-world prophecies get bent by language and culture, and you can feel that here. Is Rhaegar reading a different version than Melisandre? Did some long-ago scribe with a quill and a hangover quietly change the fate of the world? It's kind of fun to imagine that the apocalypse hinges on bad grammar. Okay, enough rambling. Let's walk through the usual suspects. Jon Snow fits a lot of boxes. Born in blood and salt in the Tower of Joy, a literal bleeding star in the form of Arthur Dayne's Dawn. On the ground outside, a life tied to ice, death, and maybe a second birth. Daenerys has her own checklist. Born in a storm, walking out of Drogo's funeral pyre with dragons, surrounded by smoke and salt tears. Stannis, with his glamoured sword and Melisandre's enthusiasm, feels more like a narrative decoy, a red herring in red robes. But what if it's not one person at all? What if Azor Ahai and the prince that was promised are collective roles, a pattern the world falls into when things get bad enough? In real-world myths, messiahs and returning kings often blur together. King Arthur, the Mahdi, various world savers who may or may not ever show up on time. Martin pulls from all of that, then muddies the water on purpose. So maybe the ending isn't about one perfect chosen one swinging a glowing sword, but about several flawed people, half fulfilling, half misreading the same tangled prophecy. Wouldn't it be strangely satisfying if the prophecy is technically right, but everyone understands it just a little bit wrong? Hold that feeling, because next we're going to nudge even closer to the wall and ask what happens when these stories crash into the cold reality waiting there. Dragon, dreams, and destiny, Targaryen visions of the long night. So if prophecy keeps being a little bit right and a little bit wrong, my dear adventurers, we also have to ask, who's doing the dreaming in the first place? Who keeps nudging history in almost the right direction, but never quite far enough to avoid disaster? For some context, the Targaryens are basically the poster family for weird, prophetic dragon dreams. Daenerys tells us she dreamed of a great black dragon, covering her with shadow long before she ever hatched Drogon. She dreams of walking through a burning house, unhurt. Those aren't just cool visuals, they're little flashes of a path she hasn't walked yet, and she's not unique. We're told, almost in passing, that many Targaryens had dragon dreams that guided or tormented them. The thing is, once you start looking for that pattern, it's hard to stop. Daenerys the dreamer sees the doom of Valyria and convinces her family to flee to Dragonstone. Aegon Targaryen actually listens, which, given Targaryen pride levels, might be the most magical part of the story. A single dream saves a bloodline and strands them on the edge of Westeros, perfectly placed for something. Maybe not just conquest, maybe preparation. That's where the Aegon theory comes in. What if Aegon the Conqueror wasn't only chasing power, but running from a nightmare? Fire and blood, yes, but also ice and darkness. We know from the World Book that Aegon spent years looking west from Dragonstone, studying maps, flying over the continent. Why now, after generations of Targaryens just sitting there? Some fans argue he had his own dragon dreams, glimpses of a long night returning from the north, and decided the only way to face it was to weld the 7 kingdoms into one. Okay, maybe that sounds a bit grand, but notice how his line keeps circling the same ideas. Aegon has his dream of a united realm. Rhaegar becomes obsessed with the prince that was promised. Aerys dreams of wildfire beneath King's Landing. Dany walks the House of the Undying and sees a blue-eyed king on a throne of skulls. A dead city, a red door. It's time to get cozy with the idea that this family is basically a long relay race of half-understood warnings. If that's true, it softens the Targaryens in a strange way. They're still cruel, still arrogant, still burning people alive and playing politics with dragons. But under this theory, they're also conscripted guardians, dragged into a cosmic war they only dimly remember. Imagine carrying that weight in your blood, but never getting the full instruction manual. No wonder they break. And that leads us to a quieter question. What if the Song of Ice and Fire isn't really about one chosen hero at all? What if it's about the world itself, and about magic and memory, trying, very slowly, to remember an ancient danger before it's too late? Hold that thought, because next we'll follow those echoes north into the snow and see who or what might be dreaming back. A gentle pause at the wall. Who are the others, really? So, if the world itself is trying to remember, it makes sense that we drift north, my dear adventurers, back to the snow, and to that impossibly long, impossibly old line of ice, the wall. For some context, the wall is more than just a big frozen fence. It's 300 miles long, 700 feet high in places, and thick enough that castles and tunnels are carved inside it. The Night's Watch takes vows there, these very old, very solemn words about being the sword in the darkness, the watcher on the walls, the shield that guards the realms of men. Basically, you give up lands, titles, marriage, all the fun stuff, and in return you get a black cloak, cold toes, and a lifetime posting on the edge of the world. The thing is, the vows never actually say what they're guarding against. They don't mention White Walkers, or others, or ice demons. They just promise to stand against the terrors of the dark. That's such a broad phrase. It could mean wildlings, or shadows, or dragons, or things we don't even have names for anymore. It's almost like the memory of the true enemy has faded, but the job description stayed. Okay, quick recap, in case some of you are half asleep already. In the books, the others are these tall, elegant, inhuman beings of ice and cold. They carry crystal swords that can shatter steel. They raise whites from the dead, and they bring with them a cold so intense it feels almost magical. On the surface, they're the monsters. They're the thing that steps out of the dark when the fire burns low. But what if that's only one angle? What if, instead of pure villains, they're more like winter spirits or guardians of some ancient boundary? Many cultures in our own world have gods of death or winter who are terrifying but necessary. You don't exactly want Hades or the Grim Reaper popping by for tea, but the cycle doesn't work without them. Martin loves that kind of blurred line, where the monster might just be someone or something whose job we don't understand. Here's the little tinfoil twist for tonight, and I fully admit I might not be smart enough to untangle all of it. Maybe the others are enforcing an old pact. Maybe they're a balancing force that appears when humans push too far with fire and blood and dragons. We see hints of this with Valyria's doom, with Targaryen dragon dreams that warn about the long night, with magic flaring up whenever dragons return. What if ice is not evil, just the other side of the ledger? Now, that doesn't mean getting hugged by another would be a fun time. It just means the story might be more complicated than good humans versus bad ice zombies. And if that's true, then we really have to ask, what is the wall actually for? Is it keeping the others out or keeping something else in? It's time to get cozy with that mystery next, as we wander into the legends of the Night's King, the first long night, and the possibility that the wall itself is a kind of spell, humming with very old, very uneasy promises. The Night's King and the Pact, punishment from the cold. So, my dear adventurers, if the wall is humming with promises, we probably need to talk about the man who tried to rewrite them. The stories say there was once a Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, a Stark, or maybe a Bolton, or maybe something older, who looked north and fell in love with the cold itself. For some context, old Nan tells it like a campfire ghost story. One night, under a hard, bright moon, this Lord Commander saw a woman with skin as pale as the moon and eyes like blue stars. Her hair was white, her touch was freezing, and instead of running, he followed. He took her to the Night Fort, called himself the Night's King, and ruled with her for 13 years. Basically, he broke every vow he had. He took a wife, he made dark sacrifices, and he turned the watch from a shield into a throne. The thing is, that sounds less like a random love story and more like a treaty violation if his pale bride was one of the others or something close to them. Then what he did wasn't just creepy romance, it was diplomacy with the wrong side. He didn't just love a monster, he tried to join her. Now, here's where the theory gets kind of fun. What if the others aren't chaotic ice zombies at all, but enforcers of a very old pact between humans and the inhuman? A pact, maybe, signed in werewood sap and human blood, back when the children of the forest and the first men carved faces into trees instead of each other. Some fans imagine early Stark kings swearing that humans would stay south of a certain line, or that they'd stop using certain kinds of magic in exchange for the long night ending. If that's true, then the wall stops being just a big sheet of ice and becomes a border stone in a cosmic contract. Not simply keep the monsters out, but this far and no farther. A glowing, frosty highlighter for where human power is supposed to end. The Night's Watch vows never mention White Walkers by name, only the terrors of the dark, which maybe hints that the real job is guarding a boundary, not waging a war. So, what if the White Walkers are punishing humans for breaking that boundary? Maybe it's overusing magic like the Valyrians did with dragons, or breaking sacred customs like guest right, or just forgetting the old gods entirely. I'm not smart enough to say which clause we violated, but Westeros has been poking every supernatural bear it can find. And if that's the case, then the final confrontation in the books might not be a simple kill the bad guys moment. It might be a reckoning, a remembering of what was owed and what was broken. The real question is, who exactly is going to have to pay that debt, and with what? Okay, enough rambling, because the next piece of this puzzle might be the creepiest one yet. The idea that some very familiar houses in the north have been quietly preparing for that bill to come due. A northern breather, who's who beyond the wall. So before we let that bill collecting horror in the north keep us up all night, I want to slow things down for a moment. Welcome back to something a little gentler, my dear adventurers. A kind of northern breather before we dive into the next pile of tinfoil. For some context, let's just quietly reintroduce where we actually are in the story. We've got Jon Snow up at the very top of the world. This broody, stark not Stark, who's sworn his life to the Night's Watch, a brotherhood in black that's supposed to stand between the realms of men and whatever is out there. On the other side of that wall, you've got the free folk, the wildlings, who are basically just regular people trying to live their lives without kneeling to southern kings, even if that means camping next to ice zombies. The thing is, the last theory we were playing with sounds complicated, but at its heart, it's actually really simple. Are the ice monsters the others just attacking for no reason, like random video game mobs? Or are they enforcing some kind of ancient deal that humans made, then broke, then completely forgot about? That's the question. Not every clause of the pact, not every obscure name in Old Tongue. Just, is this a mindless invasion? Or is it a very cold, very angry contract dispute? And if you're sitting there thinking, I don't remember half of these legends, that's totally fine. Honestly, same sometimes. You do not need to recall every Stark ancestor or every Night's King variant to get the vibe. What matters is the feeling that under all that snow, there's layer after layer of old promises, old crimes, and old magic, pressed together like pages in a frozen book we can only half read. So, let's do a tiny imagination exercise. It's time to get cozy. Picture the wall at night. No battles, no armies, just the wind. You're standing on top of that 700-foot sheet of ice, the torches along the walkway burning low and sputtering, little pockets of orange in a sea of blue-black. The wood creaks under your boots. The air is so cold it almost rings in your ears. Off to one side, a single horn blast echoes, then fades. Nothing follows. No alarm, no shouting. Just the quiet crunch of a ranging party coming back through the gate. Cloaks stiff with frost, faces unreadable, and somewhere out in the dark forest beyond, you get that prickling sense that something is watching the wall as carefully as the watch is supposed to watch it. In that moment, the details blur on purpose. You don't have to remember if this is before or after the Fist of the First Men, or which Lord Commander is in charge. What matters is that sense of an old boundary line, and something patient on the far side of it. Because next we're going to ask a similar question about the other great boundary in this story, Dragonfire. If the North is all about forgotten ice bargains, what happens when we look at Targaryen bloodlines, strange dragon dreams, and those unsettling Valyrian rituals, and ask, okay, what deal did fire make? Blood of the dragon, strange Targaryen rituals and lineages. So if the North is about old ice bargains, then with the Targaryens we have to ask a slightly different question. What kind of deal does fire make with flesh and blood? Hello again, my dear adventurers. It's time to get cozy with the strangest family in Westeros. For some context, the Targaryens don't just act royal in the political sense. They behave like they're a different species that just happens to sit the Iron Throne. Their incestuous marriages, their habit of matching silver hair to silver hair, and violet eyes to violet eyes are presented as tradition, but they're also a kind of ongoing experiment. Keep the blood the same, keep the dragon riders coming. Basically, they believe they're closer to dragons than to ordinary humans. Only the blood of the dragon should ride the dragon. Only the blood of the dragon should sit the throne forged by dragon fire. It's not just snobbery. It's almost like they're guarding a recipe. And if you squint, that recipe starts to look a lot like selective breeding. This is where one of my favorite slightly tinfoil theories comes in. What if Targaryen blood isn't just royal, but magically engineered? Not in a sci-fi way, but in the sense that Valyrian sorcerers might have nudged certain bloodlines so they would resonate with dragons, with prophecy, with whatever force gave Aegon his dream of the long night. The thing is, Martin keeps giving us dragon dreamers scattered through the line. Daenerys the dreamer, Aegon the conqueror, Daenerys herself. That's a pattern, not an accident. And then we have the rituals. The lore is full of little hints that dragons and death go together. We get dragon eggs in funeral pyres, kings burned on great fires at Dragonstone, stories of Valyrians using blood sacrifice to bind beasts. Daenerys walks into Drogo's pyre with 3 dead hatchlings and walks out with 3 living dragons. Is that a miracle, or is she unknowingly following a very old, very grim set of instructions? How many times did someone have to die in Valyria before they figured out that fire plus blood plus dragonstone equals hatchling? Some Targaryens clearly tried to push this further, to claw their way back to full Valyrian power. Think about Summerhall, that tragic accident where Aegon V and others died in a mysterious fire during a dragon hatching attempt. It sounds uncomfortably like a small, localized doom, a failed spell, a reminder that fire bargains can backfire, if you'll forgive the pun. And when we look at Daenerys and Jon against that backdrop, they start to feel less like random prodigies and more like the latest results of a very long project. Daenerys, the last Targaryen raised across the sea, somehow performs the exact ritual needed to wake stone dragons. Jon, the secret child of Rhaegar and Lyanna, unites dark ice and Targaryen fire in one body. Are they just lucky, or are they the culmination of centuries of careful and sometimes horrifying choices? Because if their bloodlines were shaped on purpose, then the real question isn't just who they are. It's what, exactly, they were made to do, and who else might have noticed that pattern before they did. Chains of silver and steel are the maesters killing magic, and if someone has been quietly nudging those bloodlines for centuries, my dear adventurers, we have to ask who. Who even has the patience and the reach to play that kind of long game? For some context, we should drift down to Old Town for a minute, to the Citadel, the Maester's home. On the surface, it's wonderfully mundane. A university, a hospital, and a think tank all rolled into one, full of sleepy ravens and overworked apprentices. They're scholars and healers, tutors for lords' children, the people you call when you need a map drawn or a wound stitched. They wear those famous chains around their necks, each link a different metal for a different field of study. Iron for warcraft, copper for history, silver for medicine, black iron for ravenry. It's very grounded, very practical. The whole aesthetic says, we are men of reason, not of dreams. And then you notice something a bit strange. Some of those chains have Valyrian steel links. Not a sword, not a dagger, but a tiny dark link that marks formal study of magic and the higher mysteries. So the same institution that rolls its eyes at prophecy and calls miracles superstition is literally handing out degrees in sorcery. That's interesting, right? The thing is, once you see that, a certain theory starts to sound a lot less tinfoil. There's this long-running idea in the fandom that the maesters are not just skeptical of magic, they're actively trying to kill it. Not in a cackling supervillain way, but in a slow, bureaucratic, we filed the correct paperwork for the end of dragons sort of way. People point to hints that dragons may have been poisoned in the past, or subtly starved by bad advice. They note how maesters downplay Targaryen dragon dreams, how they treat the prince that was promised as a mistranslated curiosity rather than a real warning. You start to wonder how many kings and lords were gently talked out of listening to visions, or pushed away from red priests, green seers, or anything that didn't fit into a neat, written record. Okay, pattern interrupt for a second. This isn't even that far-fetched historically. In our own world, big institutions have tried to stamp out folk magic, witchcraft, and rival sources of spiritual authority for centuries. Churches, royal courts, inquisitions, even early scientific societies all, at different times, tried to say, no, reality is what we say it is. Westeros might just be doing the same thing, with chains instead of robes. So if dragons and the others are both creeping back into the story, could the maesters be quietly fighting a rearguard action against the reawakening of old powers? If they fear another age of Valyria, another doom, what would they be willing to do to keep the world safely ordinary? For tonight, I thought it'd be fun to sit with that possibility, because it raises a very unsettling endgame question. If magic is needed to survive the long night, what happens if the people in charge of the books, the ravens, and the advice are secretly rooting for a world without it? Okay, enough rambling. It's time to get cozy with the shadows behind the citadel itself, and look at a few specific maesters who might not be as harmless as they pretend. Spiders, fingers, and many faces. Conspiracies in the capital. So, my dear adventurers, if the maesters are quietly nudging the world away from magic, we also have to talk about the people in King's Landing who treat the whole realm like a very dangerous board game. I'm talking about Varys and Littlefinger, the two spiders in the web, each spinning a pattern we can't quite see. For some context, Varys and Littlefinger are both master manipulators, but they move in totally different ways. Varys glides through the Red Keep in soft slippers, trading secrets through his little birds, always pretending he has no personal desires. Littlefinger, on the other hand, is climbing, always climbing, smiling politely while he kicks the rungs out from under everyone else. They're kind of like two rival magicians, each insisting it's all for the good of the realm, while we're just sitting here, not nearly smart enough to see every sleight of hand. Okay, so let's start with Varys. One of the big theories is that he's a secret Targaryen loyalist, quietly working to restore the dragon dynasty. Basically, people point to his support for Viserys and then for this mysterious young Aegon in the books, plus his deep associate connections. Another angle says he's actually an enemy of magic itself, that the sorcerer who cut him turned him into someone who wants to control or even extinguish the supernatural, which would put him weirdly close to the Maester's agenda. And then there's the really fun tinfoil, that he's tied to a larger associate plan, maybe Blackfire loyalists, maybe even the Faceless Men, using Westeros as the final act in a very long revenge story after the doom of Valyria. Littlefinger's endgame is murkier, and somehow that's scarier. He tells us that chaos is a ladder, but what's at the top of that ladder? Some theories say he's trying to root himself in the Vale's old bloodlines, using Sansa as a kind of key to Winterfell, the Eyrie, and maybe even the Riverlands. Others go darker and more nihilistic. Maybe there is no grand plan, and he just wants to keep climbing forever, burning everything down behind him, because a stable, peaceful world would finally expose how small he really is. Now, where do the Faceless Men slip into all this? If they helped end Valyria, as some people suspect, then imagine how quietly they could reshape King's Landing. A single contract could remove a claimant to the throne. A swapped face could nudge a succession crisis in just the right direction. We already have Jaqen H'ghar in Westeros, drifting toward Old Town and the Citadel, which is probably not a coincidence if there's a bigger pattern involving dragons, books, and who gets to decide the future. And the thing is, if ancient groups once brought down an empire of dragons, what are they circling now? The Iron Throne, the Wall, or something even older in the dark? We'll have to follow those shadows next. A soft recap by the hearth, where we've wandered so far. So, my dear adventurers, before we chase those shadows any further, let's pull back for a moment and sit by the hearth together. Welcome back to the simple version of the story, the sleepy version. We've wandered through a lot of lore tonight, and the thing is, it's completely okay if it all feels kind of tangled in your head. These aren't school notes. They're more like dreams we're borrowing from George for a little while. For some context, think about where we started, with Valyria, an empire of dragons and sorcerers that ended in a single day, in fire and ash, and nobody really knowing why. Was it a magical backlash from too many spells, or a deliberate attack by rival sorcerers, or something even stranger? Basically, we just know that the world broke, and the ripples are still reaching all the way to Jon on the Wall and Dany in the east. Then we drifted into prophecy. Azor Ahai, the prince that was promised. All those slippery lines that change depending on who's translating them and what they want to believe. Maybe it's Jon. Maybe it's Daenerys. Maybe it's not one person at all, but a pattern or a song or even a whole bloodline. We're kind of poking at the idea that Lightbringer isn't a sword you can swing, but a person you can love or lose. Up in the north, we brushed past the others and the Night's King, and that huge silent wall that doesn't actually mention White Walkers in the vows, just the terrors of the dark. Are they pure evil or something more complicated, with their own rules and their own idea of balance? Who really broke the world, and who is just trying, in a very icy way, to put it back into some kind of order? We touched on dragon bloodlines, too. Targaryens dreaming of fire and snow, strange rituals, and those moments where a dragon dream nudges history. Like Aegon the Conqueror, maybe seeing a coming long night and deciding, very casually, to invade an entire continent. Okay, enough rambling, but you see the shape of it. fire in the veins, ice at the edges, and people in the middle trying to make choices. And under all of that, we've had the quiet conspiracies, maesters with Valyrian steel links who study magic while insisting it doesn't exist, Varys and Littlefinger nudging kings and queens like chess pieces, faceless men and maybe Jaqen drifting toward Old Town, where books and secrets sleep together. If you don't remember every theory, that's fine, really. What matters is the feeling, that soft question of, what is the Song of Ice and Fire really about? Is it just about who wins the throne, or is it about how ice and fire, magic and humanity slowly learn to share a world? As you drift a little deeper, just hold one last idea, that all these threads we followed, Valyria, prophecy, the North, dragons, and all those conspiracies might be weaving themselves into one slow shared song. In a moment, we'll gently tug on that thread and see where it leads. The long, quiet merge. What is the Song of Ice and Fire? So, let's finally tug on that thread together, my dear adventurers. If all of this is a single shared song, what is the Song of Ice and Fire, really? Not the book series title, but the thing the world itself is quietly humming underneath all the battles and betrayals. Okay, the first and most popular idea is pretty simple. Basically, the song is two people, Jon and Daenerys, ice and fire in human form, Stark and Targaryen, the Wall and Valyria somehow meeting in the middle. It's a very neat theory, and Martin loves his poetic symmetry, so it probably isn't wrong. It's just, maybe it's not the whole thing. For some context, we've talked about Targaryen bloodlines and dragon lore, about how so many of them had strange dragon dreams, from Aegon the Conqueror to Daenerys on the Dothraki Sea. We've also wandered through the mysteries of the North, the others, the Night's King, the true purpose of the Wall. So another way to hear the title is as two great rivers of blood and magic. First men and Starks and old gods on one side, Valyria and dragons and Rhaehala on the other, finally flowing into the same sea. The thing is, ice and fire in this world aren't just elements, they're whole ecosystems of belief. Ice is the others gliding through the dark, the weirwoods watching with red sap tears, the cold, patient North that remembers. Fire is the doom of Valyria in a single catastrophic day, the Red Priest staring into the flames, the prophecy of the prince that was promised, whispering through different, slightly mistranslated texts. They look like enemies, but what if they're more like opposing notes that only make sense together? Some fans go even bigger and say the song is about magic and ordinary people slowly learning to live together again. After all, the maesters in Old Town wear Valyrian steel links to show they've studied the higher mysteries, even as they publicly roll their eyes at anything supernatural. The Night's Watch vows never mention White Walkers by name, just the terrors of the dark, as if the real problem is everything beyond the safe, explainable world. Centuries of fear, abuse, forgetting. So what if the true ending isn't one side winning, but a kind of uneasy harmony? Not dragons burning every last winter spirit, not the others freezing every last warm-blooded thing, but pacts renewed and boundaries redrawn. Maybe a wall that's less a prison and more a doorway. Maybe dragons that still fly, but under stricter, older rules. Maybe the spirits of winter step back into myth, not because they're dead, but because the balance is finally right again. As you drift a little deeper, imagine walking through a quiet post-story Westeros. No thrones, no battles, Just a world that remembers its own song at last. What would it feel like to stand under a weirwood while a dragon passes overhead and know they're both meant to be there? In the next part, we're going to take that feeling and ask a slightly stranger question. What if the song of ice and fire is also being sung by you right now, just by reading the story at all? Letting the theories fade, a soft farewell to Westeros for tonight. So, my dear adventurers, as we drift a little further from that weirwood and that dragon circling peacefully overhead, it's time to let the theories themselves start to fade around the edges. Not disappear exactly, just soften. The way candlelight blurs when your eyes get heavy and you stop trying quite so hard to focus on every little detail. For some context, we've quietly wandered through a lot tonight. We started in the burning ruins of Valyria with the doom that happened in a single day and left almost no first-hand records, which is basically an open invitation for every wild theory you can imagine. Was it a magical backlash from too many dragons and too much fire magic? Or some rival sorcerers pulling a very dramatic plug on an empire? We don't actually need to decide. It's enough to remember that image of smoking towers and empty streets, still echoing in the lore. From there, we followed those ash-dusted winds all the way north to the frozen mysteries beyond the wall. The others, the Night's King, the strange fact that the Night's Watch vows never mention White Walkers by name, only the terrors of the dark. What if the real enemy is bigger than any one legend? What if we're not supposed to solve it yet? It's kind of comforting, in a weird way, to let some doors stay closed for tonight. We've tiptoed through whispered prophecies too. Azor Ahai, the prince that was promised. Dragon dreams that maybe Aegon the Conqueror and Daenerys both shared. We're played with the idea that Lightbringer might be a person, a bloodline, a living song instead of a sword. And then we ducked into quieter places, candlelit halls in Old Town, where a maester with a Valyrian steel link pretends magic isn't real, even as he studies it. Shadowed corners where a faceless man might be listening, perfectly still, while Varys and Littlefinger spin their little spider webs of secrets. The thing is, none of this needed to be solved tonight. Not Valyria, not the Wall, not who exactly checks the prophecy hero box on a cosmic spreadsheet. The pleasure is in wandering and wondering, in letting your mind drift through possibilities without grabbing onto any of them too tightly. It's like walking through the Citadel's library at midnight and running your fingers along the spines without pulling a single book down. So if names and timelines are starting to blur, that's perfect. Let them. Instead, maybe just hold on to one or two images that felt especially cozy or intriguing. A dragon circling the wall in absolute silence. A maester quietly hiding a Valyrian steel link under his robe. A faceless man watching from the shadows of a Braavosi alley, patient as snowfall. You don't have to remember who was related to whom or which chapter a quote came from. Honestly, half the time I have to check my own notes anyway. And if you drifted off halfway through a tinfoil tangent about Old Town conspiracies, that's exactly what this was for. You can always come back later, use the timestamps, and pick up any little thread you missed. For now, it's time to get cozy with not knowing. Longer pauses, softer thoughts. Let the big, complicated story step back and keep just that gentle feeling that somewhere out there, Westeros is still turning and you can visit again whenever you like. Until the next long night, gentle invitation and good night. So before we let this little candle burn all the way down, my dear adventurers, I want to leave you with something soft and simple, not another big theory, not another tangled bit of lore, just a feeling, a sense that you are part of a very small group of late-night wanderers who like to walk the same strange roads through Westeros together. In my head, it's always the same cozy library. A couple of us half awake, one of us rambling about dragon rituals and the doom of Valyria, someone else mumbling that the maesters are probably up to something, and at least one person already asleep in the corner. If that's you right now, that's perfect. This whole thing is kind of designed for that. If you are still a little bit awake though, and only if you feel like it, I'd love to hear which corner of the world you'd like to drift off to next. Do you want to fall asleep to more dragon lore and strange Targaryen dreams? With Aegon the Conqueror, maybe seeing the long night in his sleep? Or are you more in the mood for quiet, creeping conspiracies in Old Town, where the maesters polish their Valyrian steel links and pretend they don't believe in magic at all? Maybe you want to wander the north again instead. We could follow the soft crunch of snow along the top of the wall, listen to the wind, and wonder what the others actually are beyond the stories. Or we could sit with the old prophecies themselves, turning over Azor Ahai and the prince that was promised like smooth stones, asking why every text words it differently and who might be getting it wrong on purpose. If this helped you drift off, or at least helped your brain slow down a little, you can always quietly like the video or subscribe so these long, sleepy journeys can keep going. Think of it less as feeding the algorithm and more as keeping our tiny lore library lit, one little candle at a time. No pressure at all. It's just there for when you're awake and feel up to it. For some context, I always like to send you into sleep with one gentle question, not homework, just a seed. What if the others aren't monsters at all, but another kind of lost people with their own stories and fears? Or what if the Song of Ice and Fire isn't finished, and every choice these characters make is still writing new verses in the dark? You don't have to solve anything. Basically, you can just let the questions float there, the way distant lights flicker across the shivering sea. If your brain is like mine and refuses to turn off, giving it one soft, impossible question is sometimes kinder than trying to make it go completely blank. Okay, enough rambling. It's time to get cozy with the silence. Imagine the words fading, the candle going out, and only the sound of wind moving gently over the wall, snow hissing against stone. Sleep well, my dear adventurers. Good night.